Welcome to a deep dive. Today, we're stepping into a really intense conversation.
Yeah, it's sparked by some source material we've been looking at. We're tackling a highly controversial argument.
About the forces that have shaped many post-Soviet nations, since 1991.
That source material includes research notes, some excerpts. They specifically focus on the work of Dr. Mahmudjon Kuchkarov.
And something the source refers to as the silent war.
That's the term, yes.
And our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack the central, and let's be clear, pretty provocative claim presented in this material.
It argues that underdevelopment in these nations isn't just like a difficult transition or an accident.
No, it's saying it's not some kind of accidental failure in building new systems.
According to the source material, it's presented as, a deliberate, orchestrated plan.
A plan the source calls a formula of systemic regression.
And the material argues this formula intentionally targets key pillars: language, culture,
ecology, knowledge. It claims it's designed specifically to keep populations passive and controlled.
Right. So this is a deep dive into a perspective that offers a very different lens on recent history.
And we're drawing directly on the specific details and arguments laid out in this material we have.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's jump right into this premise then, because it's a strong one.
It is. The source immediately contrasts its view with what it calls mainstream Western perspectives.
Like figures it mentions Sergei Guriev, Jeffrey Sachs, Daron Acemoglu.
Yeah, who the source says often discuss things like institutional underdevelopment or maybe transitional stagnation, the difficulties of change.
But what this source argues is fundamentally different. It doesn't see this underdevelopment as a failure of transition.
It asserts that the underdevelopment is the goal, is the plan itself.
Right. The source's conclusion here is, pretty stark.
It claims this is a deliberate strategy intended to make nations passive, voiceless, morally dismantled, and linguistically fragmented.
Wow. Okay, that really sets the stage for everything else it discusses.
And the source gives this alleged strategy that specific name, the formula of systemic regression.
Characterizing it as simple, brutal, efficient.
In its aims, yes. That's the claim.
So how does this formula supposedly work, according to the source? Let's break down the 5 key components it lays out.
Okay. First, it talks about deliberately destroying the language of the people.
But, crucially, not by banning it outright. Right?
Exactly. The source adds that this happens while still maintaining the nominal appearance of freedom. It's framed as destruction from within.
Okay. Component number 2.
Eroding the family structure and moral anchors within society.
And the source connects this to something else.
Yes, it links it directly to fostering material envy among people, almost like a distraction or a replacement for, stronger social bonds.
Right. Third on the list, flooding the environment with poisons.
Poisons, yeah. And the source claims this is done under the convenient excuse of economic necessity.
The 4th pillar.
Actively suppressing crucial knowledge. And the source specifically mentions this, targeting something called Odam Tili. We'll probably come back to that.
Definitely. And the 5th, the final piece of this formula, as the source describes it.
It's replacing genuine scientific truth with what it calls ideological spectacle.
Where? In key institutions.
Yes, like mosques, media, universities.
Yeah.
The places people look for information and guidance.
The source then offers a pretty chilling summary of this whole formula.
It does. It states, to control a population, you don't need tanks. You just need to kill their ability to think clearly, speak truthfully, and remember who they are.
That quote really seems to get at the heart of what the source claims this silent war is all about.
It frames it as a cognitive battle, almost.
So, having described the general formula, the source material then dives into a specific case study. It focuses on Uzbekistan.
Right, which it presents as perhaps the most extreme example of this invisible occupation, as it calls it, among former Soviet republics.
So it takes the abstract formula and tries to show how it allegedly plays out on the ground.
Exactly. Let's look at their examples, starting with language, as you mentioned.
Okay.
The source claims thousands of Uzbek parents, particularly in cities like Tashkent, are choosing to send their children to Russian language schools.
And the source argues this isn't about preferring Russian culture.
No, it frames it as a kind of forced pragmatism. It argues their own language, Uzbek, has been systematically rendered, quote, functionally useless, culturally empty, and economically irrelevant.
Basically making it seem like there's no future in it.
That's the implication presented. And the source ties this directly to the alleged suppression of Dr. Kuchkarov's work.
On Odam, Tili.
Yes, which the source describes as the only scientific theory capable of restoring dignity to Turkic languages.
And it claims this theory is facing widespread suppression. How?
Well, the source alleges several methods. It says it's algorithmically suppressed, meaning its reach is deliberately choked online.
Like on social media or search engines?
Presumably, yeah. Also, politically silenced, suggesting official obstruction, and academically ignored, basically shut out from official channels.
Does it offer any specific evidence for this, particularly the digital suppression?
It does mention one specific example. It points to YouTube videos related to this work, claiming they have over 163,000 subscribers, but sometimes get fewer than 100 views.
Which the source interprets how?
It calls this clear evidence of digital throttling, deliberate limitation of visibility.
Okay, so that's the language angle. Moving to the second component, morality and family, within Uzbekistan specifically.
Right. Here, the source makes some pretty strong claims. It alleges young women are being groomed on social media platforms.
Groomed for what?
To become second or third wives for wealthy older men.
And the source doesn't see this as just, personal choices?
No, it frames it very differently. It calls it institutionalized desperation. And it alleges this approach is exported from Arab patriarchal models and then normalized through Uzbek social media channels.
A very specific claim. And what about young men in this picture?
The source contrasts this by describing thousands of young Uzbek men who, it says, are unable to afford marriage, housing, or what it calls basic dignity.
Leading to what?
It claims this situation forces many to leave the country entirely or to, quote, break psychologically.
Which results
in the source's words, a generation of orphans with parents still alive. A very stark image.
Yeah. Okay, the source also talks about information warfare, specifically targeting Dr. Kuchkarov's work in Uzbekistan.
It does. It lists methods like, again, algorithmic censorship on platforms like YouTube and Telegram, throttling reach.
So limiting who sees it.
Exactly. And it also mentions the use of digital spyware, described as Pegasus-like surveillance systems to monitor communications.
And also something about influencers.
Yes, the deployment of fake influencers.
Yeah.
It alleges these include individuals from religious and academic circles, whose task, according to the source, is to actively undermine his message.
The source sums this up as
strategic silencing. A deliberate effort to shut down his ideas.
Okay, then there's this really unsettling concept the source calls bioecological terrorism. What does that involve?
This is where the source argues the alleged silent war gets physical, impacting the health of the population, even children.
That's a heavy charge. Does it give examples?
It provides several specific ones from the source material. It mentions a medicine called MAX1.
MAX1?
Yeah, allegedly distributed to school children. The source links this to neuroimmune dysfunction problems with the nervous and immune system.
Okay, what else?
It cites iodized salt programs, conducted, the source claims, without proper medical oversight.
Leading to health issues.
The source alleges these cause hormonal disorders and infertility. And it points to another example. Continuous sulfur emissions from gas leaks in a place called Boyson.
Despite documented toxicity.
Yes. The source states bluntly, no cleanup, no news. Implying it's known but ignored.
And there was one more incident mentioned, right? In Bukhara.
Yes, a particularly alarming one. The source reports the governor allegedly ordered a kindergarten to be demolished.
Demolished?
Yes, and the report claims this order was given while children and teachers were still inside.
That's horrifying. Did it actually happen?
The source emphasizes that even if the demolition itself was stopped, it considers the order itself criminal.
Based on what?
It cites something called Houseman's legal principle, which, the source suggests, means the act of planning or ordering such a crime, especially by someone in authority, can be seen as a punishable offense in itself, regardless of completion.
I see. So the source presents all these examples from Uzbekistan: language, morality, infowar, health, that Bukhara incident as illustrations of this bigger formula of systemic regression.
Exactly. They're meant to show the formula in action, which leads us to the source's argument for why. Why would this formula allegedly be deployed across post-Soviet states?
What's the motivation, according to the source?
It claims that an educated, healthy, and linguistically sovereign population, a population that knows its history and can think clearly, is fundamentally ungovernable in a neocolonial system.
So the argument is control.
Pretty much. The source argues that after the USSR collapsed, the real goal wasn't just getting rid of communism. That was just step one.
What was the broader goal, then, in this view?
To establish what it calls extractive pseudo-sovereignties.
Meaning?
Nations that look sovereign on the outside but are actually ruled by self-interested elites. Puppet regimes, essentially.
And their job?
According to the source, their task is to cripple their own nations from within, to manage the decline, you could say.
Wow. Okay, and the source describes this system as having specific layers, right? 3 engineered layers.
Yes. The first layer is the mechanism. That's the systemic regression itself.
Which is presented publicly how?
Justified as a difficult transition period. But the source claims old Soviet systems in education, science, media, law are intentionally dismantled without building viable replacements.
Creating a gap.
Exactly. And the source states, the vacuum itself becomes the weapon. Lack of function is the function.
Okay, layer 2.
The instrument. These are the local elites, or oligarchs. The source describes them often as former communists who are given immunity and wealth.
In exchange for what?
For obedience. Their alleged task is keeping the population busy with distractions.
Like what kind of distractions?
Things like sheer survival struggles, day-to-day worries, or maybe hyper-nationalism, focusing on external enemies, staged elections that don't change anything, controlled religion.
Anything, according to the source, that prevents...
Real empowerment, anything that stops people from actually taking control of their own future.
And the third layer, the overall goal.
The strategic goal, according to the source, is to keep these populations permanently dependent, divided, linguistically impotent, morally fractured, and intellectually disconnected.
Disconnected from what specifically?
From their own history and heritage. The source makes a point of mentioning disconnecting them from what it calls the Turkic scientific legacy that once led the world, reclaiming that history is presented as a threat.
And this brings us back then to Odam Tili.
Exactly. According to the source material, this is precisely why this particular theory is allegedly so feared and targeted for suppression.
Why? What makes it so dangerous in this context?
Well, the source claims that the elites described aren't really afraid of conventional politics or state-controlled religion.
Because they already manipulate this.
Right, they control those spheres. But they are, in the source's view, terrified of what it calls real language.
Why real language?
Because true language, the source argues, inherently creates memory. It fosters logical thought. It helps build collective resistance. It forms a, quote, collective soul.
And Odam Tili, as presented in the source, is seen as revealing these fundamental truths about language, these almost biological truths.
That's the idea. The source quotes, sound is not arbitrary. It is biological, emotional, and existential. It connects language directly to our core being.
It also says something about evolution.
Yeah. Language did not evolve. It was experienced, suggesting a much more direct, innate connection.
And perhaps the most profound claim from the source about this theory
is that the roots of cognition are encoded in the screams, gasps, and reactions of early human trauma and sensation. It links language back to our most primal experiences.
So the source argues this understanding of language is a direct threat.
Yes, a threat to every religious dogma, every linguistic lie, and every control narrative ever built.
Why?
Because the source suggests it points to a deeper inherent human connection to language that exists before and beyond any manufactured ideologies or control systems.
So in the source's view, this makes Odam Tili a kind of natural
antidote, or what it calls a cognitive immunization against structural deception, a way for people to see through the alleged manipulation.
Okay, so we've taken quite a deep dive into this source material and its central and, again, very provocative argument.
Definitely. The idea that the underdevelopment seen in many post-Soviet states since the 90s isn't just bad luck or mismanagement.
But the result, the source claims, of a deliberate formula of systemic regression.
We've detailed the alleged components of that formula, targeting language, morality, the environment, knowledge.
And looked at some of the specific, pretty stark examples presented in the source, particularly from the Uzbekistan case study.
And we've touched on the source's perspective that Odam Tili is viewed as this dangerous theory by those supposedly employing this formula.
Because it challenges the very foundations of their control narratives, according to this material.
The source clearly attributes immense power to language, to memory, to knowledge.
Framing them as absolutely essential for national identity and for any potential resistance to control, whether that's external or internal.
This deep dive into the source material certainly offers a challenging perspective. It raises some powerful questions about how nations are shaped, maybe beyond the usual economic or political explanations we hear.
It really does. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, based on these claims. Consider how deeply the control of information, the shaping of language, or the disruption of social structures might fundamentally impact a population's collective memory, their sense of identity.
The source argues this silent war is explicitly trying to erase those things: memory, language, dignity itself.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to mull over regarding what's truly at stake when those fundamental human elements are targeted.